Yes, Professor Chomsky.
Yeah.
If you walked 2 blocks back from where you're standing right now, you'd come across a marvelous example of what I've described in various occasions. It's an excellent example of above-ground bunker neo-fascist.
Of a what?
Above-ground bunker neo-fascist architecture called Vilas Hall. Vilas Hall is the School of Communications, the Com Arts building, the School of Journalism. I imagine there are a number of journalism students in the audience tonight. I imagine there are a good number of people who, well, they filter in, they become middle echelon apparatchiki for the media empire that you've discussed. They come out imbued with the ideology of value-free, objective reporting. It's the major ideological offensive against the kind of model that you want to pose as an alternative. I wonder if you could talk to the audience here about the ideology of objectivity and value-free reporting within this system.
Well, there is such an ideology, and it's interesting to see how it's interpreted. Objectivity means you take what people in power say and you report it accurately without distorting their quotes. And then sort of down at the bottom of the column, down at the bottom of the column, you may say things like what I quoted, if you're really an intrepid reporter. You say, well, this may seem to be inconsistent with the spirit of the peace agreement. That's objective reporting. If the State Department announces that Nicaragua has called for a revolution without borders, then even if you know it happens to be a lie, an objective reporter just reports it. Because they said it, after all. It's true that they said it. It would be introducing opinions to say it's a lie, I suppose. So there is an ideology of objectivity, and I wouldn't just scoff at it, incidentally. The fact of the matter is that, by and large, American reporters, if you had a bunch of reporters describing something they saw, I would tend, by and large, to trust the American reporter at least as much, maybe more, than those who come out of other traditions. Because this business of objectivity is not completely to be scoffed at. The effort to try to keep your reporting to the facts and not to introduce opinion is a worthy effort, and sometimes it shows up in accurate description. And there are some reporters, I should say, who do it extremely well and have a very good record of it. And in fact, this even includes reporters who work for the journals that, in my view, are right at the core of the propaganda system. So take, say, John Kiffner of the New York Times. I think you can tell when the New York Times editors want some story to be reported accurately for their own purposes. That's when they send John Kiffner to report it, because he's going to report it accurately. And when they don't want it reported accurately anymore, they take him off and put him back at the Metro desk. That's one test as to what the editors have in mind. And there are times when they want stories reported accurately, and there are some journalists who really do it. On the other hand, when they send Tom Friedman out, their current chief diplomatic correspondent, you know what they want is propaganda. You want somebody who's going to say, as he just said after he was advanced to this august post, that the United States is now, sort of under the Bush administration, planning to support the Central American Peace Accords, which were introduced and proposed and advanced by Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. A mission there, but that's part of the game. That's what happens when you send Thomas Friedman to report a story. And I presume that the editors understand these things. That's, incidentally, I presume, why Thomas Friedman is chief diplomatic correspondent and John Kiffner isn't, but you'd have to ask the editors about that. So to get back to your point, the objectivity, it's a good thing. It's a good value to be objective in reporting, and the people who do it honestly do very good journalism. But as you're implying, that ideology can be used to be a distorting mechanism, and quite commonly is.
Is George Bush's hands-off policy just a cover, and all the action of the executive branch will be handled covertly? Or is it an opportunity for the legislative branch and the American people to take back the reins of power?
Oh, I don't. Well, first of all, what makes you think George Bush has a hands-off policy?
That's how it's reported. That's what I.
Yeah. Okay.
That
but
perception
right.
Of
But
hands-off
that's that's not very good evidence.
The reception
in fact, the fact of the matter is Ronald Reagan had a hands-off policy. In fact, Ronald Reagan probably didn't even know what the policies were. It's an interesting fact about the last 8 years, which again should not be laughed at. The fact of the matter is, the media had to put on a big pretense about this, but everybody knew, everybody with their eyes open knew, and most of the population knew, that for the last 8 years the country hasn't had a chief executive. Now that's an important fact. In fact, I think that's a step forward in manufacture of consent. And in fact, it's maybe a sign of the future of political democracy. I think the United States made a leap into the future in the last 8 years. They've sort of retracted a little, but I think they'll go on, and I think other industrial democracies will follow us. If you could get to the point where voting is simply a matter of selecting purely symbolic figures, then you would have gone a long way towards marginalizing the public. And that pretty well happened in the last 8 years. You had somebody who probably didn't know what the policies were. His job was to read the lines written for him by the rich folk, what he's been doing for the last 30 or 40 years. And he seems to enjoy it, and he gets well paid for it, and everybody seems happy. But to vote for Ronald Reagan is like voting for the Queen of England. That's an advance. I don't really mean this as a joke. I think that's an advance. It's progress in marginalizing the public. Part of marginalizing the public is taking the formal mechanisms of participation which exist and ensuring that they don't lead to a crisis of democracy by being substantive. And what better method can you think of than simply reducing them to the selection of symbolic figures? I think that happened. I think the press has covered it, though they doubtless know it. But as for George Bush, I think you got to return to a sort of more normal situation. I don't have any reason to believe that there's any hands-off policy. If there will be the same kind of resort to covered activities that there's been in the past. When does the government resort to covered activities? Well, typically when the domestic enemy doesn't allow it to carry out the activities in public. That's when a government resorts to clandestine activities. Clandestine activities are difficult, complex, expensive. They carry the danger of being exposed. It's much easier and more efficient to carry out violent activities overtly. And a government, typically our government in particular, when it resorts to clandestine activities, it's usually because it's afraid of the public. Those activities are not much of a secret from anybody else. They're certainly not a secret from the victims. They're not a secret from from the various mercenary states that we have involved in it, like the whole stuff in the Iran-Contra hearings. That wasn't a secret to Nicaragua, it wasn't a secret to Israel, it wasn't a secret to Taiwan or Saudi Arabia or Brunei. It wasn't a secret to anybody out there. It wasn't a secret to the whole array of shady businessmen who were in it to make a buck, like Richard Secord and Albert Hackham and so on. Fact of the matter is, it wasn't even a secret to Congress and the media. As I said, they knew about the Contra flights, they just weren't reporting it. They also knew about the arms sales to Iran through Israel, and they weren't reporting it. They couldn't suppress any of that any longer after a plane was shot down with an American mercenary, and after the Iranian government revealed the fact that the National Security Advisor was wandering around Tehran giving out Bibles and chocolate cakes. At that point, you couldn't suppress it any longer, so it became public, and then comes a cover-up operation. But the point is, it wasn't really secret to anybody much, and I think you can easily document that. I mean, I was, for example, writing about it from public sources throughout this whole period. But the point is, you could keep it secret from the public. It was a low enough level so you could keep it secret from the public, and that means the domestic enemy didn't get too outraged over it. Remember that you've got to control enemy territory. And that's what covered operations are for. If the government happens to be committed to activities, to violent or terroristic or subversive or other activities that the domestic public, the domestic enemy, will not tolerate, it'll move to covered actions. That's what they're for, and there's no reason to believe that the Bush administration will be any different from others in this respect. Especially, in fact, less reason. After all, what's Bush's background?
Dr. Chomsky, you a statement in the recent Insurgent interview regarding the feminist movement that it has been the most important the actual effects it's had on social life and cultural patterns you quoted accurately, it's been a lasting, important movement with an impact on everything. Why is it that not only the left has trouble with, you know, in some ways working with the feminist movement, but perhaps tolerates, to what I feel is an unacceptable degree, anti-feminist individuals and perspectives within its mix? That's one question. And the second question...
Could you be more specific about what you had in mind? I mean...
Well, I don't know. That's a tough thing because I'd rather not go on.
Okay.
But another one I'd like to throw out for you is that you are a world-class linguist, and I'm wondering how this kind of blends in or interfaces with your political work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, actually the issues of feminism, the context of that remark was my expression, if I recall correctly, was an answer to a question of what happened to the movements of the 60s. And there is a propaganda story about this. The story is that the movements of the 60s had all this idealism and so on and so forth, and it all faded, and after that everybody's just interested in themselves, and it all disappeared. And I think that's nonsense. I think that's propaganda, and it's in fact an attempt to make people feel that they ought to give up. But the fact of the matter, if you look objectively, at least as I look, it seems to me that the movements of the 60s just expanded and grew in the 1970s, and expanded and grew even more in the 80s, and they now reach into much wider areas of the society than ever before. Groups like this, for example, would not have been around, and certainly wouldn't have listened to a talk like this 20 years ago. But now they do all over the country, and not just in universities, also in small towns and churches and so on and so forth. I think the movement's just expanded. That's why the Reagan administration was forced into clandestine activities, in fact. Enemy territory was out of control. But as for the reason I mentioned the feminist movement specifically is because that's a product of the 70s. And in my view, as you quoted, accurate, I think in terms of its overall impact, it's probably the one that had the greatest impact on cultural patterns and relations and structures of authority and so on and so forth of any of them, and that's the 70s and the 80s. Now, to get back to your point about the left, a large part of the origins of the contemporary feminist movement were in the left, and they were in reaction to the sexism inside the left. That was a big issue in the late 60s, a big issue, and it was a very emotional and complicated issue. And that was one of the roots of the modern feminist movement. Of course, feminist movements go way back. And it could be that the left still tolerates sexism and sexist individuals. I'm sure it does. If to the extent that it does, that's just something to be overcome. Not just on the left, everywhere else as well. I don't see it in anything special to do with the left.
Hi, my name is Nancy, and I work with the International Socialist Organization. And I just want to start by saying I, like I'm sure many, many, many other people who are here tonight, are deeply indebted to your work. It's been absolutely essential in helping us cut through the kind of garbage that we're faced with every day when we try to figure out what's going on in the world. But I think there's also, if I can continue, I think there is also a problem in the analysis that I've seen in your works and that you presented tonight, in the sense that I think we can tend to lose the forest for the trees, that you present so many, astonishing details about what is wrong with the system and about what is wrong with the media, that we can tend to lose sight of what I think the really key question is, which is why is this control necessary in the first place? And I would submit at least that I think it's because there's I got a minute and a half, I swear to God it's no longer. It's because there's antagonistic interests involved. They didn't talk about milkmaids and dairy maids and spinsters and laborers in the 17th century for no reason. It was because they were the working class. And what we see today in this country, I think, is quite frankly, let's speak bluntly, a ruling class which tries to control a working class population. And that's what it's about, is holding on to that power. If that's the case, then it seems like to me the question that we face is how to organize to change that system, to challenge capitalism. And I think in that effort, you do a disservice to your listeners and to the people who respect your work when you equate Lenin with Stalinism as blithely as you did tonight. I say that, and I think it's also important to point out that that is an unquestioned assumption and also an easy applause getter we saw that you share with the mainstream media. And I think if it were actually that simple, the horrific kinds of measures that even bourgeois historians describe as a counter-revolution under Stalin would not have been necessary if they were all the same to begin with. Now, in short, to sum up, the situation that you have outlined tonight, I think, is extremely serious, and I think it's important that we all take it seriously. What we're talking about is literally the fate of millions of lives around the world, particularly in the international politics that you described. That being the case, then I think we need a full and a serious and a fair discussion of various different alternatives, not just talking about the horrors of capitalism, but actually how to change it to end this stuff once and for all.
Well, I think you made, yeah. I think, well, there's several questions there. One is about the discussion of the United States, and I think what I said is approximately what you said, except I didn't use some of that rhetoric. Which I don't think is particularly helpful, to tell you the truth, either analytically or to understand or whatever, but it's the same picture. John Jay had it straight. The people who own the country ought to govern it, and the people who own the country have basically now are a network of corporations and conglomerates and banks and so on. They ought to govern it, and the way they do it is by the methods we've described. Now, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I didn't happen to talk about it tonight, but I've written about this topic. I haven't just made the charge. I've written about it and explained why I think it's true. And it doesn't bother me if I happen to agree with the mainstream media on this. Trotsky, to pick somebody who you remember, once he was charged in the 1930s with agreeing with the fascists in his condemnation of the Soviet Union. And he pointed out that his critique was to be true. He wasn't going to abandon it if somebody else happened to say it for different reasons. So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism. The idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now, that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1917. Now, when Lenin came back to Russia in April 1917, he took a different line, quite a different line from the one he'd had in the past. You take a look at Lenin's work, it shifted character in April 17. In April 1917, it became kind of libertarian. That's when he came out with the April Theses, and that's when he wrote State and Democracy. It came out a year later, but that's when it was written. And these were State and Revolution. These were basically libertarian works. They were very much more in the mainstream of sort of left libertarian socialism, from sort of this range that goes from anarchism over to left Marxism of the Pannekoek-Luxemburg variety. And he talked about Soviets and the need for a workers' organization and so on. In fact, came really closer to what the essence of socialism was always understood to be. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. That's where you begin with. Then you go on to other things. But the beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution, if you want to call it that. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky after Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is that, a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. He knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the people wanted to hear. It's just like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it, doesn't mean he believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. In any event, whatever your interpretation is, when he took power, he reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production. The Soviets and the factory councils were instruments of workers' control. And same, you could say they're defective instruments, it's never worked out better and so on, yeah, no doubt. But they were the instruments that had been developed in the course of popular struggle to implement basically workers' control, and those were the first things to go. By early 1918, it's still really before the Civil War set in, Lenin's view was pretty clearly expressed. It was the view that both he and Trotsky took the position that what you need is what Trotsky called a labor army, which is submissive to the control of a single leader. He said modern progress and development and socialism requires that the mass of the population subordinate themselves to a single leader in a disciplined workforce. Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. In fact, it's the exact opposite of it, and was criticized for that by in a spirit of some solidarity, because the revolutionary forces were still operative. He was criticized for that by people like Rosa Luxemburg and by Pannekoek and Gorter and the other mainstream sort of left Marxists, and I think they were right. It seems to me that, and then it just goes on from there. I mean, Lenin reconstructed the czarist systems of oppression often more efficiently, Cheka, KGB, and other techniques of control and oppression. I think from that point on, there was nothing remotely like socialism in the Soviet Union. I think it was, in fact, in my view, it was a precursor of later forms of totalitarianism. Now, you could, that's what I think happened, and I think that's what you discover if you look at the facts. Now, why is it called socialism? Well, I think I think that's complicated, and we should look at it. There's the Soviet Union calls it socialism. And after they took control they did take control pretty soon of most of the international socialist movement, because primarily of the prestige of having created something sort of socialism. Incidentally, just a side remark, Lenin remained, despite it all, a sort of an orthodox Marxist in many respects. And as an orthodox Marxist, he didn't believe that it was possible to have socialism in the Soviet Union. This was supposed to be up to his death, or shortly before his death, when he was still writing, speaking lucidly. He kept the view that the Soviet revolution was a holding action. They were just going to hold things in place until the real revolution took place in Germany, because the revolution, according to Marxist doctrine, was going to take place in the most advanced sector of modern industrial capitalism, for all the reasons that you read about in Marx. That's where the revolution had to take place. Obviously, that wasn't the Soviet Union, so there couldn't be socialism there. It was just some kind of holding action. And that presumably gave some sort of justification for eliminating the socialist institutions. I don't think it's a real justification, but probably that was the internal justification. And again, in taking that view, he was in accord with the mainstream Marxist tradition. Well, after that comes the view that all of this is socialism. And why should the communist parties take that view? I think the reason is because they wanted to sort of exploit the moral force of socialism, which was quite real. It's kind of hard to remember that today, but at that time it was very real. This was regarded as a, as a progressive moral force, and by associating their own destruction of socialism with the aura of socialism, they hoped to gain credit in the working classes and other progressive sectors. Now, the West also identified that with socialism, and they did it for the opposite reason. They wanted to associate socialism with the brutality of the Russian state. that undermined socialism. So what you had is that the two major world propaganda agencies, for their own and quite different reasons, were claiming that this is socialism, that this destruction of socialism is socialism. And it's very hard to break out of the control of the world's two major propaganda agencies when they agree. They agreed for different reasons, but they basically agreed, and that then became doctrine and dogma. Well, I think people should ask whether that's true. Take a look back and see whether the moves that Lenin took and that Trotsky supported him in taking and that they both advocated had anything to do with socialism as it was understood by, say, in the Marxist tradition or in the left libertarian tradition. And I think the answer that you'll discover when you look at that is that they didn't. In fact, this was a destruction of socialist institutions. Well, you know, this may be true or it may be false, but if it's true, and I think the evidence pretty strongly supports it, then I don't see any reason why we shouldn't express that fact. And I certainly don't think that we should be deterred in expressing this fact if other people who's, you know, fascists, whatever, happen to condemn the Soviet Union, just for the same reasons that Trotsky mentioned in the 1930s.
Getting back to losing the forest for the trees, could we have part 2 of the book pulping story, please?
Pardon?
Part 2 of your book pulping story. You promised during the question and answer it might come up. You said you had some further...
Oh, the aftermath of that pulping incident. Yeah. Is that what you meant?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of a little more subtle and complex, which is why I didn't talk about it. But here's what actually happened. The book was later decided to rewrite and update it. And we did, and it came out from South End Press, which was then in existence, a small radical press run by cooperative, run by a couple of young people. And it was published as The Political Economy of Human Rights, a 2-volume book that came out in 1979. Well, South End Press wasn't going to pulp it, so it exists. In fact, you can even buy it. Now, what happened at that point? You can't pulp the book any longer, so how do you react to it? Well, there are 2 ways of reacting to it. The main way is to ignore it. There were a lot of things in the book. You can read it and see what was there. But, for example, there was a discussion of, it was a discussion of U.S. foreign policy in the media. Basically, that's what it was. And extensive case studies of both topics and so on and so forth. Mostly it was ignored, as you'd predict. But it wasn't entirely ignored. There was one exception, and a very interesting exception. Let me give you the background. It explains some of the more subtle ways in which the system works. In this, one of the things we did in this, in order to put the propaganda model to a test, we didn't call it the propaganda model then, it's the same thing. In order to put it to a test, we tried to compare sort of paired historical incidents, kind of like I was doing in connection with the freedom of press issue. I mean, history doesn't create exact controlled experiments, but there are enough cases that are similar enough so you can test how the media are going to deal with them. And we looked for such cases. We looked for atrocities. And we divided the atrocities we looked at into 3 categories. What we called constructive bloodbaths, meaning ones that are good for U.S. power and the corporate class, so they're constructive. Benign bloodbaths, one where U.S. power and privilege doesn't care very much one way or another, it's sort of irrelevant. And nefarious bloodbaths. Those are the ones carried out by official enemies. So we had various types of benign, constructive, and nefarious bloodbaths. And we gave quite a number of examples of these. Well, our prediction was that the media would welcome the constructive bloodbaths, that they would ignore the benign bloodbaths, and that they would become outraged over the nefarious bloodbaths. And in fact, in the case of the nefarious bloodbaths, they would invent all sorts of fantasies and so on and so forth to make them look even worse than they were. That was the prediction. And we gave a bunch of cases, and we showed that, I think, we tried to show, and I think did show, that the predictions were correct. Now, there's actually another prediction that comes out of that model, which we didn't make, but it's implicit if you think about it. And that has to do with the way that this exposure will be responded to. What you'd predict, if you think it through, is that our discussion of the constructive bloodbaths would be ignored, because to reveal the fact that the media welcomed huge bloodbaths, as they did, would not be very conducive to the interests of power or to the media. It would also expose the fraud about the apparent anger over nefarious bloodbaths. So you'd expect the constructive bloodbaths to be ignored. As far as the benign bloodbaths are concerned, you might expect an occasional statement, since it's, I mean, the fact that the media ignored the benign bloodbaths doesn't show such terrible things. It doesn't, at least they didn't applaud them. And as long as you can exclude the role of the United States in being involved in them, not terrible, maybe a few odd comments. With regard to the nefarious bloodbaths, what you'd expect is fury and venom over the fact that the media, that the fabrications over bloodbaths of the enemy were exposed as a fraud. And that's important, and that can be used. It can be used, in fact, to defame the critics. See, if you show that people are lying about the crimes of official enemies, you can easily distort that into a defense of those crimes, right? Like, okay, now what happened? Well, let me take two cases, which were very close. Two cases that we discussed were the slaughter in Timor from 1975 to 1979, and the slaughter in Cambodia in the same years, 1975 to 79. We compared those two cases. The one in Timor we called a benign bloodbath. The United States didn't care much one way or the other. So hundreds of thousands of Timorese get killed. It's not very interesting. The case in Cambodia was, of course, a nefarious bloodbath. That was the bad guys doing it. And we gave a very detailed account of what evidence was available about these two. They're in the same area of the world, the same years, the same time frame. The evidence available was comparable. The slaughters were apparently comparable in scale. The one in Timor was considerably greater relative to the population, but probably roughly comparable in scale. The difference was that in Cambodia it was carried out by the enemy, Pol Pot, whereas in Timor it was carried out by a friend, Indonesia. And furthermore, it was carried out by Indonesia with American arms, which were provided by the Carter administration, which were expanded. The arms flow was expanded by the Carter administration as the atrocities increased. Well, how did the media deal with this? First, fact number one, we went through this in detail. The media dealt with the Timor bloodbaths by suppressing them. There was considerable coverage of Timor, believe it or not, in 1974 and 75. This was all in the context of the breakup of the Portuguese Empire. As Indonesia attacked Timor and the massacre started with U.S. support, coverage began to drop. When the massacre hit its peak in 1978, and it was really approaching genocide with increasing U.S. support, coverage dropped to zero, literally zero. That's the way they dealt with the Timor massacre. What about the Cambodia massacre? Well, within weeks after the Khmer Rouge took power, they were already being accused of genocide by the New York Times. About a year later, they were being accused of carrying out auto-genocide and of having murdered 2 million people. In fact, even of having boasted of having murdered 2 million people. That became the conventional line. There then came a huge outcry ranging from the Reader's Digest and TV Guide over to the New York Review of Books, and including just about everything in between. Vast outcry of outrage over the communist monsters who were carrying out this horrifying bloodbath and so on and so forth. Interestingly, in all of there was a tremendous amount of fabrication, just plain fabrication of evidence. For example, I'll just give you one example. Take this 2 million boast of 2 million killed. You know, that's what everybody's heard. You ask people, how many people had Pol Pot killed by, say, 1977? They'll say 2 million. Here's where it comes from. There was a book published by a French priest, François Panchaud is his name, who's from Cambodia. He wasn't there then, but he knew about Cambodia. He published a book in French. The book was, of course, not available in English. It was in French. It was reviewed by a French journalist named Jean Lacouture. It was reviewed in France. That review was immediately picked up and translated in the United States. It appeared in the New York Review of Books. That's the fastest translation of a review of a French book that's ever appeared. In the review, Lacouture said this. He said, according to Panchaud, the Khmer Rouge boast of having murdered 2 million people, auto-genocide, horrifying, and so on. He gave a whole bunch of quotes from the book about the horrifying things the Khmer Rouge said, and so on and so forth. That was immediately picked up by the rest of the media. It was all over the place, you know, newspaper articles, oh my God, look what they're doing, and so on and so forth. Well, I was curious at the time, because that didn't, you know, I hadn't seen the evidence about that, and I just wanted to know what was going on. So I the book was unavailable, so I wrote to friends in France and asked them to send it to me. And I got the book. And I probably was the only person in the United States who had read it, although it was being quoted all over the place on the basis of this review. And I quickly discovered that the whole review was a total fraud. Whatever was going on in Cambodia, that's not what the book said. The book didn't say anything about a boast of 2 million people. The quotes that were given in the review either didn't appear in the book, or maybe you could sort of figure out what they were from, you know, some wording a little bit like them, but they were grossly distorted. And some of them weren't even quotes from the Khmer Rouge. They were quotes from Thai and so on. But and in fact, every factual statement in the review was just totally false. Here's the way the 2 million figure came. Ponchot in the book says that about 800,000 people were killed in the American War, 70 to 75, meaning primarily by American bombing in the war that the United States ran from 70 to 75. That's 800,000 people. He then said that according to the American embassy in Bangkok, 1.2 million had died, not been killed, since the war was over. Well, Lacouture, during the review, just added those two numbers together, called them the Khmer Rouge killings, and then added the boast for good effect. Well, that's where that figure comes from. Anyhow, after I read the book, I wrote a letter to Lacouture, who I know, and I told him, look, I don't know what the facts are about Cambodia, but the relation between your review and the book is zilch. And I think you ought to correct it because your review is being quoted all over the place. Well, he actually published corrections in the New York Review. You know, I said, yeah, he made a couple of mistakes. He said, well, maybe the number killed wasn't 2 million. Maybe it was just in the thousands, he said. A slight difference, you know, a factor of 1,000 difference. But he said, it really doesn't matter, you know, it's terrible anyway, and so on. Well, after his corrections appeared, they were dismissed, and people kept repeating the 2 million figure that he invented, almost half of which was attributed to the American War, notice. Well, that's one example, but it's just typical. If you read our chapter on this, you'll see a level of fabrication which, you know, is mind-boggling. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. Now, this had nothing to do with the fact, of course, there was a massacre. In fact, as we pointed out, the massacre was probably comparable to the massacre in Cambodia, which was in Timor, which is a huge massacre. We also pointed out that of all the evidence available, there was one part that was being suppressed systematically by the American press, interestingly. That part was the information given by State Department intelligence. Now, the State Department Cambodia watchers, you know, State Department intelligence, they were the only people with any evidence about what was going on in Cambodia. And they apparently had pretty good intelligence. They claimed to be able to even pick up radio transmissions and all sorts of stuff. And they were giving a totally different story. They said that what was going on, that there was, you know, big slaughter, but they said it was in the tens or hundreds of thousands, and it was not mass genocide, but it was rather mostly harsh conditions and, you know, brutality and so on. That was the position of the only people who knew anything. And that was systematically excluded. It was just the wrong picture. You know, it wasn't bloody enough for the purposes. Well, we went through all of this stuff, the suppression of the Timor massacre, the vast amount of lying about the Cambodia massacres, and we gave that as an example of treatment of paired massacres, where they were both treated. Now, here's the one place where the book was not ignored. What we said about constructive bloodbaths, totally ignored. What we said about Timor, almost totally ignored. To the extent that it was mentioned, the U.S. role was excluded. What we said about Cambodia, however, that elicited a huge new outrage over the fact that we were defending Pol Pot. Well, we were defending Pol Pot by saying that he was carrying out a slaughter comparable to the major slaughter that the United States was backing in Indonesia, and pointing out that, in fact, that was the picture given by American intelligence, the only people who knew anything about it, and then talking about the way this was distorted in the interests of the propaganda system. But that didn't matter. Here, see, what we were doing was challenging the right to lie in the service of the state, and that's a very important right to maintain. So therefore, the standard view is, and you can read this all over the place now, is that we, or usually it's me for some reason, I don't know why they decide it's me, but we were defending Pol Pot and, you know, sort of apologists for Pol Pot. You take a look back and you'll see that we described it as a major massacre. We said a lot is uncertain, you know, and then just described the facts as they were and compared them with the media fabrications. And you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to expose media fabrications, and the reason why that was discussed, the one part of the book, virtually nothing about Timor ever is discussed. The reason why that one part is discussed is because that can be used by further lies to defame and undermine critics. So therefore that's done. Well, that's the more subtle way in which the propaganda system works. I should say, incidentally, that some of this stuff is really kind of amusing. Those of you who read this stuff will have seen it. William Shawcross wrote a book a little after that, in which he claimed, The Quality of Mercy, it's called, very favorably reviewed all over the press. Everybody fell in love with it. In the book, he claims that there was silence over the Pol Pot atrocities. And then he asked the question, how could this happen? You know, it's called Holocaust in the Modern Conscience. Well, first of all, was there silence over the Pol Pot atrocities? No, there was a vast uproar over the Pol Pot atrocities. That started a couple of weeks after it. At the time when they were being accused of genocide, they had probably killed a couple of thousand people at the most. Within a year, as I said, it was being everywhere from TV Guide and the Reader's Digest over to the New York Review, and then it went on like that. A huge chorus of protest. Further were tons of fabrication. But it's flattering to say, it's useful, it's serviceable to say there was silence. Why is it serviceable? Because if you can claim that there was silence, then you can raise the profound question of why the West was silent over this massacre, and that means from now on we must be even more diligent in exposing the crimes of official enemies to overcome the fact that we were silent this time. So immediately Shawcross is quoted all over the place, and every newspaper is saying, oh my God, we were silent, how could we have been silent, and so on. Then Shawcross goes on to explain the silence. You take a look at his book, he explains the silence. First this was in the Washington Post, then in his book. He says the reason for the silence, the primary reason for the silence, is the skepticism of the left, primarily me. So in other words, by my skepticism, I silenced all the Western media and governments. It's a lot of power. Furthermore, and remember what that skepticism was. It was a skepticism about documented lies. Furthermore, he cites an alleged statement in a footnote. He doesn't date it or identify the source. There's two good reasons for that. One is that the citation is fabricated. The other is that the source, to the extent that there's a source, it's in a book, it's in exactly this book, which went to press after the fall of Pol Pot and came out almost a year after the fall of Pol Pot. So what he's claiming is that in a book that went to press after Pol Pot was overthrown and that appeared almost a year after, in that book we succeeded retrospectively in silencing the entire Western media and governments for 4 years. Well, that's, you know, not only were we powerful enough to scare the entire West into silence, but we even could do it by magic, you know. Now that was quoted all over the place with great awe. The point is there's no absurdity so extreme that it won't be quoted with respect if it's useful. And here it's useful for several purposes. One, to protect the right to lie in the service of the state. Two, to undermine and defame critics who you can't answer. And three, to claim that we didn't look hard enough, we were silent over this atrocity. Well, there was an atrocity that the West was silent over. It's the one we documented, Timor. And they were silent over it because the West was doing it, and therefore you're silent over it. That's the real question of Holocaust in the modern conscience, but nobody will discuss that one. Well, these are all examples of more subtle ways of controlling thought, more subtle and complex. That's the aftermath I had in mind. It's a very interesting story. We review it in Manufacturing Consent. Who's next? I lost track.
Hi, I'm Liz Chilson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Coordinating Council on Nicaragua. I think that most people here probably know that Wisconsin and Nicaragua have been sister states for 25 years, and the Wisconsin Coordinating Council on Nicaragua has led in transforming what was originally a symbolic relationship to a vital tool for peace. And we've just published the book, as Will just mentioned, called Friends Indeed, the story of U.S.-Nicaragua sister cities, which is about the over 100 U.S.-Nicaragua sister cities that have formed since the revolution. One of my question has to do with that movement and some of your insights on it, because I think that recently the popular opposition to the war in Nicaragua has fallen out of the major news media. It's been identified, I think, as a non-issue. And that kind of effect of the media has a very fragmenting effect on movements for social change. And I wonder,
Yeah.
I think that sister cities is one way that we can
Right.
begin to institutionalize.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. The coverage of Nicaragua altogether has dropped very significantly. And I assume that that's as usual on command. The New York Times, in fact, removed its bureau chief, Stephen Kinzer. And if you look at coverage, it's in fact dropped very fast. Well, I think that's connected with U.S. policy. There is a shift in policy after the Reagan period. And here you have to look back a little bit. As far back as 1980, there has been a debate over Nicaragua, like over Vietnam. The debate is how you strangle and destroy Nicaragua. Now, the Hawks say you do it by terror and violence. The Doves say you do it by what are now called kinder, gentler methods. You do it by economic strangulation, you know, by maintaining a low-level terrorist force, by mobilizing on the border so they can't demobilize and turn resources to reconstruction from the destruction and so on. That's the other way. And by 1986, about 80% of those who are identified as leaders in the polls, that means elites basically, you know, managers, executives, political figures, those guys, about 80% of them were opposed to the Contras. They thought that the terror option pursued by the Reagan administration was just stupid. Stupid for a number of reasons. One is it was stirring up protest at home. You know, overt violence does have a way of stirring up protest among these unwashed masses who don't like, you know, murdering children and, you know, raping women and cutting people's heads off and so on. There's all these unreconstructed people, and they get annoyed by that kind of stuff. So you stir up disruption at home when you have, when you direct your terrorist army to attack defenseless targets, soft targets as they were called, as the U.S. terrorists were doing at that time, openly, in fact, it wasn't a secret. So that stirs up too much protest, so it's dumb. Also, it makes the United States look bad internationally. I mean, the United States is an overt violation of the World Court decision, and, you know, it doesn't look good in our international relations and so on. And finally, it's kind of useless. I mean, there are much better ways to strangle and destroy a tiny country, which for all kinds of obvious historical reasons is totally dependent on its relations with the United States for survival. You can just do it in smarter, quieter ways. Now, that was the major, you know, that was the dominant position among elites already by 1986. Now, the Reagan administration is not off the spectrum of American opinion, but it's at an extreme. It's in an extreme position on the spectrum. It's extreme. I mean, the people around Reagan were people who were deeply committed to violence for its own sake. I mean, it's as if you kind of like torture in itself rather than using it as an end for some, you know, as a tool for some other purpose. Well, that's kind of counterproductive. And rational people don't do that. You use torture when you need it, but it's not an end in itself. There's no gain in itself to torture, inflicting pain and terror and so on. And their conclusion, sort of a rational conclusion, was it's just not useful. It's bad. It's stirring up protests and so on and so forth. So the more rational thing to do is the policy that the Bush administration is now turning to, I think. That policy is, here's what it looks like to me, maintain the economic strangulation, which incidentally is also unlawful. I mean, we talk about or we should talk about the World Court having condemned the Contra attack. It also condemned the economic warfare as illegal violation of treaties. Again, this is never reported, but that was the World Court decision. The violation of treaties involved, the embargo is unlawful. It's also a criminal act, and the World Court demanded it be terminated. But the point is, you can assume that nobody's going to talk about that. So you continue the strangulation, keep the Contras, it's interesting that the United States was, with all the huge amount of resources that were poured into maintaining a mercenary force inside Nicaragua, they were unable to do it. That's a pretty remarkable fact. There's no guerrilla movement in history that had a fraction of the support that the Contras had. It's just unimaginable. I mean, they were getting 3 supply flights a day just to keep them going. They were armed at a level, you know, they were better armed than the Sandinista army. They were better armed than units of the American army, in fact. That's actually true. They had advanced communication equipment in the field, which allowed them to get information from U.S. surveillance flights. It's always under surveillance, the country, by, you know, high-tech aircraft, which could give them information on the actual disposition of the Sandinista forces so that they could attack defenseless targets with impunity and carry out terror there in accordance with the orders of the State Department. It's not secret, incidentally. Now, you know, that kind of level of support, there's just no guerrilla army in history that could dream of anything like that. With all of that stuff, they couldn't keep them in the field. The minute the level of support began to drop, they all broke for the border. The contrast to El Salvador is fantastic if you bother to look at it. You know, El Salvador, you had an indigenous guerrilla force, no support from outside as far as anybody knows. Their arms were mostly gotten from the Salvadoran army or purchased internationally, so they were using American arms, like, you know, they're using M16s. And it's like just a side remark. For the first time now, the guerrillas in El Salvador are apparently being aided by Nicaraguans. So Elliot Abrams can finally be happy. What's happening is that as the Contras broke for the border and went across, because, you know, the game was over, they figured, they began to sell their arms to corrupt Honduran army officials who were selling them off to the Salvadoran guerrillas. So for the first time, the Salvadoran guerrillas are beginning to show up with Soviet arms, AK-47s and so on and so forth. And the reason is that those are the arms that the CIA supplied to the Contras. Yeah. So instead of having just M16s like they used to have, you know, American arms they got from the Salvadoran army, they now got Soviet arms sent by the CIA to the Contras and now sold off to the Hondurans or selling them off to the Salvadoran guerrillas. So there is finally aid from Nicaragua to El Salvador, like they've been claiming all along. And so here's another side remarks, I'm sorry, but this information comes from a very good source. So good, in fact, that the press totally censored it. This information comes from the head of counterintelligence, who defected in Honduras, went to Mexico, was widely interviewed in the Mexican press. His name is Horacio Arce. Like most of the Contras, he has a nom de guerre, you know, pseudonym. His pseudonym was Mercenario. You know, they don't kid around when they're, I mean, for the American press, they know who they are. He was the chief of counterintelligence. He was the guy who became chief of intelligence in 1985, replacing a man named Ricardo Lau, who was beginning to be an embarrassment because it was beginning to be pretty obvious that he was involved in terrorist activities throughout Central America, including probably the murder of Archbishop Romero, who was identified by the chief of Salvadoran intelligence and defected as having been involved in that. This guy was getting to be an embarrassment, so he disappeared and he was probably killed. And they needed a new chief of intelligence, and this guy came in. Well, he's been chief of intelligence since 1985. He defected last November. It's the most important defector yet, far more important than, you know, the defectors who get huge publicity when they come from Nicaragua with all kind of fabricated stories. This guy was ignored. He had totally the wrong stories. You know, he was telling about how they were advised, you know, they were directed. He told, for example, about how he was trained illegally in Elgin Air Force Base, some Florida or someplace like that, where he was flown in illegally, of course, trained in the United States by, you know, Green Berets and the 82nd Airborne and so on and so forth. He talked about, he identified people in the American embassy by name in Honduras who were posing as aid officials but were actually working with the CIA and were, you know, giving tactical advice and support to the Contras. He mentioned their names. He described the way the Honduran army, the Honduran military, is directly involved in Contra military activities in Nicaragua, both by intelligence and participation and so on. He went through all, he described how their task was to attack defenseless targets for the purpose of ensuring that Nicaragua cannot carry out social reform. He describes this, and all sorts of stuff, which is just useless. And he also describes what I just said, how the Contras, now that they've broken for the borders, are selling their arms to the Salvadoran guerrillas. Well, you know, all of this stuff is news, and in fact important news, in fact, and from a very good source, so important that as far as I know, there's no word about it in the American press. You might look and check and see. That was kind of a digression. So the Salvadoran, coming back, the Salvadoran guerrillas have had no support from outside as far as anybody knows. They're indigenous to the country. They're facing a military force which on paper at least is the most powerful in the region, much more powerful on paper than the army of Nicaragua, and they're somehow ineradicable. In contrast, the Contras who involve all sorts of mercenaries, including Nicaraguans, Hondurans, who are bribed. Honduran peasants are bribed with big bribes by their standards, like $500. That's a couple of years' income to join. All sorts of things, huge amount of support, tremendously high level of military equipment and so on. They just can't keep them in the country. I mean, I think you could keep a guerrilla force in the United States with that kind of support. I'm not kidding. I think you could probably maintain a guerrilla force in the mountains of Kentucky with the kind of force with the support that was given to the Contras. They couldn't keep them there. There's a lesson in all of this. There's an obvious lesson in this comparison, so obvious that nobody in the press is ever going to draw it because it's the wrong lesson. You can figure it out, so I won't draw it. Well, all right, so what is back to the Bush administration plans? I assume that they can maintain a low-level terrorist force inside Nicaragua. It's inconceivable that they can't do that. So probably they'll keep, that's why I think, it's one of the reasons I think those reports about the illegal Contra flights from El Salvador are probably accurate, apart from the fact that the sources were accurate in the past. Presumably, the Bush administration will keep some low level of support for mercenaries and terrorists inside Nicaragua. They assume that the level will be so low that the cooperative press will be silent about it, as they've been so far. And that's important because that means Nicaragua can't demobilize. And it's important to keep them mobilized. For one thing, because when you're mobilized, the society is repressive, just like the United States during World War II, which was virtually totalitarian. And if they're repressive, you can use that for propaganda. So you can get, the Neiman fellows to cry about repression and so on in the manner that I described. So you want to do that. You want to keep them repressive. You want to keep them mobilized. You want to make sure that they can't divert their extremely limited resources to reconstruction from this fantastic damage. Second thing the United States will try to do, if Congress and the press goes along, they will do, is maintain a Contra force on the Honduran border. That's what all this humanitarian aid nonsense is about. You want to maintain the force on the border in violation of everything, as I pointed out. And the reason, again, is you maintain a threat. As long as you maintain a military threat, you can ensure that the government won't demobilize. Okay? And that's important because we want them to suffer. But, of course, that's less at a lower level than terror. The idea is precisely, here, get back to your point. Also, you continue the economic warfare and the pressure on international lending institutions. You intimidate the allies so they won't give them aid and so on. All of this was abetted, incidentally, by the hurricane. The hurricane was a devastating blow, close to $1 billion in damage. The United States, of course, doesn't give them a penny. In fact, they love it. They're gloating over it. The allies, the U.S. allies, are giving them a pittance, like Canada and West Europe, are giving them virtually nothing. Partly because they're intimidated by Big Brother, and partly because they're a lot more colonized than they like to believe. They like to believe they're all independent and free thinkers and so on. Mostly the European intellectuals believe every bit of nonsense they read from the American press. The amount of cultural colonization is very high, though they're not aware of it. So they're all upset about Sandinista repression, although the repression in El Salvador and Guatemala, which is 1,000 times worse, that doesn't bother them at all. So they keep giving them aid. So there's that. And this combination of operations, it is assumed, will prevent Nicaragua from recovering. And after all, that's the point. The point is to prevent what Thomas Borges had it right on the nose. You got to prevent them from constructing a society that works, because if they do, others are going to emulate it. And pretty soon, U.S. domination of the region is going to erode. And besides, that kind of rot can spread to other places where people have similar problems and decide to use their resources for their own ends and so on. You get real trouble. So you got to prevent it from working. And the United States certainly has the means to do that, short of the Reaganite absurdity of just inflicting pain and terror for its own sake. Well, that's the kinder, gentler methods. And one part of that has got to be to cut back the coverage. Part of that is the role of the media. Stop reporting it so people forget about it and don't notice it and so on. And the idea is the effect will be you'll quiet the domestic dissent. You'll return the public to apathy and obedience by not reporting this stuff anymore. So I think your point is precisely accurate. The role of the media in this system is precisely to keep quiet about what's going on. And I expect we will find less coverage. I mean, you'll find coverage when you can find something you'll call Sandinista oppression, or when if there's mass starvation, as there may well be because of the hurricane, that'll be covered, and it'll be attributed to Sandinista incompetence, you know, or mismanagement or something. So that kind of thing will be covered. Or here's another thing that will be covered. The next big move, it's already been announced, is for the Contras to demand that they've asked for $10 million to establish an independent television station in Nicaragua. Well, if Nicaragua allows what's called an independent television station, that means it's telling the United States, you take over our television. There is no way in the world in which a small country can compete with the United States in television. I mean, that's just out of the question. You know, I mean, if Nicaragua continues to do what most countries do and have state television, then of course they can be denounced as totalitarians. Notice we don't denounce Israel as being totalitarian because it has only state television, but that's the usual dichotomy. So the idea is now we demand that Nicaragua have a television station run by the United States with a beginning capital of $10 million, which by, I mean, Nicaraguan standards is, you don't even know how to discuss it. It's off the wall. I mean, the United States already dominates the media in much of the country. Much of the media, the only thing you hear is U.S. radio from powerful radio transmitters in Honduras and Costa Rica, and even television. If the United States can put a television station right in Managua with all the resources the United States can pour into it, and they just, you know, that's the propaganda agency for all of Nicaragua. So that's the next thing, and the media will be all excited about this, and that'll be the test of freedom. You know, they're only free if they allow the total communication system to be run by the United States. Otherwise, they're totalitarians. That'll be the next line that comes along. And there'll be that kind of coverage, but no coverage about what's going on. That's got to decline precisely so that the American movement will decline, and people will go back to the passivity and obedience that becomes them, as I said. So I think your point is quite accurate, and the question, as usual, is whether the American population is going to let them get away with it. You know, that's the device. We don't have to let it work.
Bravo, Professor Chomsky. You are very brave. This is about the UN. I don't get information from the New York Times and the ABC, NBC, all of the news. When I want information, I go to the specialized agencies of the UN. And there, you can find, nowhere did they know that the population of the world was 5 billion. The UN got that information. Information on the radioactivity of the air and so forth. They have a vast amount of information. They also had information about cesium in milk products, which were going to highly populated areas, Boston and New York, for 2 years. The UN had this information. Citizens groups badgered the media to bring this information. It was never there. But at the UN, we were able to get that information. So what we did is we wrote a proposal which was presented to the General Assembly because we felt that we as parents have a right to vital information about the food and the water and the air, and the UN has that information and it just sits there. So we wrote this proposal calling for a two-way global information service. We presented it to the General Assembly very well in '87 at the International Conference on the Relationship Between Disarmament and Development. It was a very important conference. It received very good support. The year later, we tried to present the proposal again. This time we had gained the support of the Swedish government, the Australian government, and Costa Rica. There was violent opposition to the proposal, to the point where 2 ambassadors were told that they would be terminated if they in any way supported any proposal asking for a global information service. Now in September, the UN is meeting again, and we're going to try to push the proposal. We were shocked by the opposition that this proposal got, because after all, it's a very modest proposal. We're just asking for vital information. And we tried to get, anyway, it was terrible, the opposition. So we're going to present the proposal again in September. Do you have any ideas on strategy?
Was that a question or a statement? Well, it wasn't a question, so I don't have to answer. But let me just say, in response to the non-question, that I actually have a book coming out. I like these phrases like manufacture of consent and necessary illusions and so on. They're too good to let drop. So I have another book coming out called Necessary Illusions, thanks to Reinhold Niebuhr. And in it, one of the things, it's more of this kind of stuff. One of the things I discuss is the coverage of the UN. And it's extremely interesting. It's not that the UN is never covered. Whenever the UN passes a resolution denouncing the Russians for the invasion of Afghanistan, big story, you know. If the UN condemns the United States for a violation of international law, there's no story, you know. The coverage is extremely interesting when you look closely. Actually, for those of you who were there this afternoon, I mentioned one example, the terrorism thing, which is very important. But let me take one case which is illustrative of the kind of thing you're talking about. At that same UN session in 1987, there was a big series of disarmament resolutions. And they were very interesting because they came out right at the time that Ronald Reagan was being hailed in the front pages as a peacemaker. That was the summit in Washington. December 1987, summit in Washington, Reagan the peacemaker, you know, very excited and so on. Well, right at that time, the UN passed a series of disarmament resolutions. Here's what they were. There was a resolution opposing militarization of outer space, Star Wars. 154 to 1, no abstentions. You never get a vote like that in the UN. You can guess who the one was. A vote in favor of opposed to the development of new weapons of mass destruction. I think it was 135 to 2. The United States picked up France on that one. Vote for a comprehensive test ban, which is incidentally supported by about 75% of the American population. The vote on that was like, I don't know, 140 to 3, something like that. France and England, we picked up on that one. And that's the way the resolutions were. Well, they were not reported, because that just wouldn't fit with the idea of Ronald Reagan, the peacemaker. On the other hand, other things were reported, like, for example, the resolution condemning the Russians in Afghanistan. Big story on that. And there was a lot of coverage of the UN, but this is the way it was. Now, this has been going on over the years, for many years. You go back to the 1940s and the early 1950s, and the UN was everybody's darling. Tremendous coverage of the UN. It was marvelous. It was magnificent. And the reason was, that, or let's say, the correlation is, I assume the reason, that at that point the United States had an automatic majority in the UN. Anything the United States proposed, the UN voted. That just had to do with the relations of power at the time. The Russians were obnoxious. They kept vetoing things. And there were all, you take a look back at the discussion at that time, leading American scholars, you know, anthropologists and so on, had all kind of deep theories about why the Russians are vetoing everything at the UN. I was a graduate student at the time, and you know, we used to make fun of the 3 or 4 of us who sort of thought this was idiotic, made fun of this. One of the main proposals, which came from people like Margaret Mead and others, was that the reason the Russians were so negative and obnoxious at the UN was because they raised their children in swaddling clothes. And that makes them negative. And then when they get up at the UN, they just say no all the time. No. Diaperology is what we called it. Anyhow, that was the big, you know, profound theory. Well, over the years, the thing has changed, you know. By now, the United States is isolated at the UN. The United States vetoes everything. We veto way more resolutions than anybody else. The votes I just reported are not untypical, you know. So what happened? Well, it turns out that the UN has lost its moral authority. You find articles, like the New York Times Magazine had a big story about why the world is out of step. Literally, you know. How come the whole world is against the United States? What's wrong with them? I mean, it's not that we raise our babies wrong, you know, it's that the rest of the world is doing something wrong. And then comes a profound analysis of why the world is out of step and, you know, what's the matter with the world culture and so on and so forth. And the UN has lost its moral authority. The United States doesn't pay its dues anymore. You don't report it. And now the UN is, you know, is obnoxious because they're not following orders. Well, you know, that's a dramatic example of how the media fall in line. And what you're talking about is another case of it. And again, just the way you're doing, the reason you're getting such outraged reaction is that implicitly, at least, you're exposing all of this. And that's no good. So therefore, the outraged reaction, which is just all the more reason to keep doing it.
You've been watching Part 2 of a presentation by Noam Chomsky, the conclusion of the question and answer segment from his March 15, 1989 lecture, Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media. Part 1 of this presentation, which includes the entire lecture and the beginning of the question and answer segment, is also available as streaming video. To find out more about Noam Chomsky and his many works on linguistics, philosophy, and U.S. foreign policy, please visit his website at www.chomsky.info. This lecture was recorded at the Wisconsin Union Theater on the Madison campus of the University of Wisconsin on the evening of March 15, 1989. Special thanks to Steve Breaker of Worthwhile Films and Rosemary Bodolay of Art Industry for their work in making this program possible. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about this presentation and about the many other programs in the PDX Library, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find links to websites that provide further background on the issues discussed in this presentation, and you'll find streaming video and audio of lectures and interviews with writers such as Jonathan Kozol, Phyllis Bennis, Ralph Nader, Natalie Angier, and many others. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots democratic community media.
They take him off and put him back at the Metro desk. That's one test as to what the editors have in mind. And there are times when they want stories reported accurately, and there are some journalists who really do it. On the other hand, when they send Tom Friedman out, their current chief diplomatic correspondent, you know what they want is propaganda. You want somebody who's going to say, as he just said after he was advanced to this august post, that the United States is now, sort of under the Bush administration, planning to support the Central American Peace Accords, which were introduced and proposed and advanced by Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The mission there, but that's part of the game. That's what happens when you send Thomas Friedman to report a story. And I presume that the editors understand these things. That's incidentally, I presume, why Thomas Friedman is chief diplomatic correspondent and John Kiffner isn't, but you'd have to ask the editors about that. So to get back to your point, the objectivity, it's a good thing. It's a good value to be objective in reporting, and the people who do it honestly do very good journalism. But as you're implying, that ideology can be used to be a distorting mechanism, and quite commonly is.
Is George Bush's hands-off policy just a cover and all the action of the executive branch will be handled covertly? Or is it an opportunity for the legislative branch and the American people to take back the reins of
Yes, Professor Chomsky.
Yeah.
If you walked 2 blocks back from where you're standing right now, you'd come across a marvelous example of what I've described in various occasions as an excellent example of above-ground bunker neo-fascist.
Of a what?
Above-ground bunker neo-fascist architecture called Vilas Hall. Vilas Hall is the School of Communications, the Com Arts building, the School of Journalism. I imagine there are a number of journalism students in the audience tonight. I imagine there are a good number of people who, well, they filter in, they become middle echelon apparatchiki for the media empire that you've discussed. They come out imbued with the ideology of value-free, objective reporting. It's the major ideological offensive against the kind of model that you want to pose as an alternative. I wonder if you could talk to the audience here about the ideology of objectivity and value-free reporting within this system.
Well, there is such an ideology, and it's interesting to see how it's interpreted. Objectivity means you take what people in power say and you report it accurately without distorting their quotes. And then sort of down at the bottom of the column, down at the bottom of the column, you may say things like what I quoted, if you're really an intrepid reporter. You say, well, this may seem to be inconsistent with the spirit of the peace agreement. That's objective reporting. If the State Department announces that Nicaragua has called for a revolution without borders, then even if you know it happens to be a lie, an objective reporter just reports it, because they said it, after all. It's true that they said it. And it would be introducing opinions to say it's a lie, I suppose. So there is an ideology of objectivity, and I wouldn't just scoff at it, incidentally. The fact of the matter is that, by and large, American reporters, if you had a bunch of reporters describing something they saw, I would tend, by and large, to trust the American reporter at least as much, maybe more, than those who come out of other traditions. Because this business of objectivity is not completely to be scoffed at. The effort to try to keep your reporting to the facts and not to introduce opinion is a worthy effort, and sometimes it shows up in accurate description. And there are some reporters, I should say, who do it extremely well and have a very good record of it. And in fact, this even includes reporters who work for the journals that, in my view, are right at the core of the propaganda system. So take, say, John Kiffner of the New York Times. I think you can tell when the New York Times editors want some story to be reported accurately for their own purposes. That's when they send John Kiffner to report it, because he's going to report it accurately. And when they don't want it reported accurately anymore...
Power?
Oh, I don't... First of all, what makes you think George Bush has a hands-off policy?
That's how it's reported. That's what I...
Yeah, okay,
that
but...
perception
right,
of a
but
hands-off
that's not very good evidence.
I mean, the reception of it.
In fact, the fact of the matter is Ronald Reagan had a hands-off policy. In fact, Ronald Reagan probably didn't even know what the policies were. It's an interesting fact about the last 8 years, which again should not be laughed at. The fact of the matter is, the media had to put on a big pretense about this, but everybody knew, everybody with their eyes open knew, and most of the population knew, that for the last 8 years the country hasn't had a chief executive. Now that's an important fact. In fact, I think that's a step forward in manufacture of consent. And in fact, it's maybe a sign of the future of political democracy. I think the United States made a leap into the future in the last 8 years. They've sort of retracted a little, but I think they'll go on, and I think other industrial democracies will follow us. If you could get to the point where voting is simply a matter of selecting purely symbolic figures, then you would have gone a long way towards marginalizing the public. And that pretty well happened in the last 8 years. You had somebody who probably didn't know what the policies were. His job was to read the lines written for him by the rich folk, what he's been doing for the last 30 or 40 years. And he seems to enjoy it, and he gets well paid for it, and everybody seems happy. But to vote for Ronald Reagan is like voting for the Queen of England. And